This is Mara and Ben for Stellar Strategy Gaming. Today we're going to be talking about some of the races from Eberron, specifically the Kalashtar and the Shifters. In the past, these kinds of videos have done really well, so we decided to give you a little bit more of what you wanted.
Yes, now the Kalashtar are what we're going to start with. And they're a very interesting species. We'll get a little bit more into the overall ability detail, but for now, just from a raw stats perspective, they're definitely set up to be one of the stronger races. Here I have it as they get +2 wisdom and +1 charisma, which is incredibly powerful because that opens them up to, I think, 5 classes in total of 10. So yeah, they can play about half the classes in the game, which by itself is amazing and gives them immense multi-classing abilities if you want to piss off your DM infinitely. But then on top of that, they also have resistance to psychic damage, and they have a telepathic ability, which is equivalent to, I believe it's 10 times their level, which could be completely overpowered. So they're definitely very, very strong in that regard. And I would almost say perhaps a bit too strong. They remind me a bit too much of higher level Great Old One warlocks. And even if the psychic damage resistance doesn't replace it, instead stacks or whatever it is, you're getting into a level of rules lawyering with the race plus the class that I don't think anyone really wants at their table.
One thing I'm going to point out quickly with what Mara said, as far as you can play at certain things, obviously if you want to do a weird Kalashtar barbarian for some reason, even though none of their stats specifically work with it, you do you. We're just talking about the stat bonuses that link up to specific classes. With the wisdom bonus, the obvious choices are cleric and druid. With the charisma bonus, you're getting into things like warlock and bard, as well as paladin. Now, the Kalashtar don't actually dream when they sleep. They're connected to a spirit entity. A noble spirit is what the book describes it as. And this could be a really useful tool for a DM because it could act at least as sort of as an NPC that could potentially give the party information. So, for example, if you're in that situation where you've got a puzzle that's designed for 6-year-olds and your party has spent 3 sessions trying to figure it out, the spirit guide could be something that would drop a helpful hint, or it could be for larger plot points. A couple of very specific ways I might use a Kalashtar as a player character. One of them would be as a cleric of the trickery domain. With the charisma modifier, it would be helpful in things like deception and persuasion, which are charisma abilities. Now, the Kalashtar are influenced by their noble spirit, but they can rebel against it. I would also point out that trickery domain does not inherently mean evil. It's just a deity that uses something other than raw force or force of law to get their way. Now, that being said, I could really see it being a fun setup if you have your Kalashtar interacting with their spirit guide and also interacting with some agent of an evil deity, sort of an angel on one shoulder, devil on the other type of deal. The book specifies that they don't have direct conversational interactions with their spirits, but it also mentions that one of their quirks is that they sometimes speak to their spirits. I take this as sort of the way people might speak to a deceased relative, or a very religious person might talk to whatever higher power they believe in. And of course, at your discretion and your DM's discretion, you can get a little bit creative with that as long as it doesn't break the game or annoy the rest of the party too much. Another possible option, it's more of a flavor thing than it is a mechanics thing, but with that spirit guide, College of Whispers Bard actually makes a certain amount of sense because having access to the spirit guide would provide the character with a kind of a pool of knowledge that would just be sort of conducive to building up the pool of secrets and stories that the Whisperer Bards like to take.
Yes. Now, the sort of final thought I have on the Kalashtar would be that, I think it was already mentioned, they're very similar to Azimar. And now that is a mixed bag in some ways. Some people might say that Wizards got a bit uncreative there. However, I would actually argue that it's the opposite. It was a very clever thing of Wizards to do, because Eberron is a bit of a unique fictional setting, and while very few people go strictly by the books, if you're running a hardcore lore-bound, you can't really play an Aasimar in the realm of Eberron because the planes are very different there. In fact, the scientists in Eberron, according to the lore, think that there might not be other planes. It's just surrounded by the ether. So what that means is that you can't have, for example, tieflings or Aasimar. So you need to add substitutes. And that really is what the Kalashtar screams to me, is they sort of created this sort of substitute, but it's good because it's unique in its own way. You can see where it's influenced from, but it's not solely dependent on that, unlike what we're about to get into.
Before we do jump into the shifters, just one thing I will say in regard to what Mara is talking about. The Kalashtar do not have much in the way of direct combat ability apart from their psychic damage resistance and their advantage on wisdom saves, but they don't have some of the abilities that are specifically the ability to frighten enemies or deal extra damage or anything like that. And that's something I really appreciate as an option in D&D. I totally get it if you want to play a hack-and-slash character that's just going to mow through the enemy, and you want to pick races such as Dragonborn that have abilities that are conducive to that. Have fun with it. But I do also appreciate when we're gifted with a race whose abilities are a little bit less combat-oriented, a little bit more role-play-oriented, a little bit more built for that role-play style of play. Now, with the shifters, I really wanted to like the shifters, and we're going to get into some of the reasons why that didn't quite happen. They're pretty standard in terms of how old they live to be, their size, their base speed. They have dark vision. As a bonus action, you can assume a more bestial appearance. This transformation lasts for 1 minute, until you die, or until you revert to your normal appearance as a bonus action. When you shift, you gain temporary hit points equal to your level, plus your constitution modifier, a minimum of 1 temporary hit point. You'll also gain additional benefits that depend on your shift or subrace. Once you shift, you can't do so again until you finished a short or a long rest. So here's the first problem. This is a once between rests ability that only lasts for 1 minute. So essentially you have this ability for one combat or one encounter, if you will, and that's it. And to me, that just strikes me as being kind of weak, kind of thin as an ability, unless it's something really, really powerful, such as the half-orc's relentless endurance ability.
Yes, and actually to further that thought just a little bit, the druids get their wild shape, which if you go down Pact of the Moon lasts like an hour, I think. And on top of that, if you are a sorcerer, doesn't matter what path, then you have access to the Alter Self spell, which does literally everything that the most powerful variant in the shifters has to offer, which is, I would say, the damage is the most promising one, especially if you're going for a build where you don't necessarily want to have a lot of weapons on you at all times, or you're like a wizard, so you're a bit squishy. However, again, going back to the Alter Self, that gives you I think 1d12 attack. It might scale based on the level, but if you're a sorcerer, you can make that last 24 hours to this once per action or once per combat ability. So it's quite underwhelming. And sort of going into my problem with just how the shifters were developed, they're sort of white bread to me. They're not anything really unique. The Kalashtar, they're something special. They're not original, but they are special. It's a bit like how Game of Thrones is clearly based on Lord of the Rings, but it's definitely very, very different. You know, it's something that really evolved and separated from it, as most fantasy has, that is good. Whereas the shifters, they have the same problem that the Ranger class does, where they're a bit too much of everything at the same time, and at the same time, they're also the closest thing we have to werewolves, and they're very underwhelming. So it's, again, a bit like the Ranger, how the Ranger is the closest thing we have to playing Aragorn from Lord of the Rings, but because it sucks, it makes it even worse, because we wanted something from this which we didn't get.
So we have 4 kinds of shifters. The first kind is called Beasttide. You get an increase to your Constitution by 2, your Strength by 1. So, Barbarian, probably, maybe Fighter. Paladin, have proficiency in Athletics. When you shift, you gain 1d6 additional temporary hit points. While shifted, you have a +1 to your armor class. That's fine, but it's just fine. It doesn't... There's no damage immunities. There's no... +1 is nice, but it's not a huge buff. Next, we get into Longtooth, which seem to be more like werewolves. Your strength increases by 2, and your dex increases by 1. So there again, strength-based fighter, paladin, barbarian maybe. You have proficiency in intimidation. While shifted, you can use your elongated fangs to make an armed strike as a bonus action. If you hit with your fangs, you can deal piercing damage equal to 1d6 plus your strength modifier, instead of the bludgeoning damage normal for an unarmed strike. You do 1d8 damage swinging a longsword one-handed at someone. So this is pretty underwhelming. And I don't really know what else to say about it other than there's not much to say, because it's underwhelming. Again, you compare this to something like a Dragonborn's breath weapon. The class reminds me a little bit of the half-orc, especially because of the strength buff and the intimidation skill, but I would pick a half-orc over this any day, just for the relentless endurance. Swift Stride, graceful and quick. Your dexterity score increases by 2, your charisma score increases by 1, you have proficiency in acrobatics, and your shifting feature is while shifted, your walking speed increases by 10 feet. Additionally, you can move up to 10 feet as a reaction when a creature ends its turn within 5 feet of you. This reactive movement doesn't provoke opportunity attacks. Now, that last 2 sentences, where when a creature ends its turn within 5 feet of you, you can move up to 10 feet as a reaction without provoking opportunity. That sounded great until I read it a second time and was paying a little bit closer attention. If a creature ends its turn within that distance of you, that means that it's already made its attacks for that turn. So this doesn't get you out of melee with anything. And once you've made the movement, there's nothing stopping the thing from chasing you the next round. So I'll never say no to extra movement, but it's not anything really special or really exciting. What this really reminds me of is a much weaker Tabaxi. When we did our video on the Tabaxi, we talked about how kind of broken their movement ability is. I can understand wanting to nerf that a little bit, come up with a less powerful version of it, but not this less powerful. Then the final one is the Wild Hunt. Wisdom increases by 2, Dex increases by 1. Proficiency in Survival. While shifted, you have advantage on Wisdom checks. No creature within 30 feet of you can make an attack roll with advantage against you unless you're incapacitated. So the buff seems decent for a monk, I would say. Possibly a cleric, possibly a druid. Any of those are fine. But they're fine. It's fine. It's aggressively fine. There's nothing about this, again, that's all that compelling. Advantage on wisdom checks. It's not wisdom saves, so it doesn't really protect you from damage. It just helps you with perception rolls, and that's only for the 1 minute. So it's the kind of thing where if you're walking through a forest and you're trying to figure out if you're about to get ambushed and you're doing perception checks along the way, the ability goes away very quickly. The absence of the enemy's ability to have advantage on you is good, but it's not really spectacular. I'd rather they not have advantage on me because they're dead. And yeah, just sort of overall, it's not quite there in terms of what it could do, what it could really represent. When I'm thinking of these, the shifters are sometimes called wear-touched. They're rumored to be descended from lycanthropes. So I'm thinking of like something really powerful, some real broken ability. And I understand not everything that's going to be in every book is going to be game-breaking, and it shouldn't be. But I don't want it to lose hands down to things in the player's handbook, which these do.
Yeah, we're not asking for the werebear with a minigun from the Russian Guardians movie. No, we just... something that I think is much more comparable that we're sort of looking for is in the Innistrad lore. There are the in-between things that Avacyn sort of blessed. That's kind of what we're looking for here. They're not spectacularly overpowered, but they definitely are stronger than average people and get a bit of respect for it. The other thing that kind of bothers me about Shifters is that their lore is just completely pathetic compared to, like, everyone else. It's just... With Aasimar, you have like 3.5 pages of lore for no apparent reason, and for Kalashtar, you at least know where they actually come from. Same with Changelings, and which I find absolutely hilarious how the species literally about mystery and intrigue we know more about than the species which is incredibly limited in its shape changing. But the last thought I really have on this matter for today would also just be that this is a worrying pattern that I've seen with Wizards of the Coast. They add these sort of half-baked races that aren't really strong enough to keep up with current content. Now, if the Shifter had released in the Player's Guide way back when, I could see it. You know, it would be on the same tier level as, like, Gnomes, maybe, for power level mechanically. However, I am literally looking at Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, which has some of the most overpowered sub-races and spells and feats I've ever seen. And by comparison, the Shifter is just, it's sad. It does not keep up, and it will not keep up. It will be surpassed by whatever the next race book is. That's just a fact of it. Is there any last thoughts, Ben?
So at the risk of being a little bit contradictory about it, the most popular campaign setting is called the Forgotten Realms. The idea is that it's a world that's so ancient that a lot of things have been lost to history. The whole realms have been forgotten. The title of Eberron is literally Eberron, Rising from the Last War. So with that, I could see there being a case for maybe some of your history has been lost. Maybe you don't quite have all the answers on everything. However, I do agree with Mara that this isn't that. This is something that's just sort of half-baked. And given the rest of how unimpressive the rest of the class is, it's just a little bit more letdown. I'm kind of a flavor nerd, which is part of why I dig on the Kalashtar. Because Kalashtar, they're powerful, but they're not broken. They don't even have dark vision. But, you know, you get this sort of interesting backstory you can play around with, and the Shifters, we're not even really getting that. Now, if the Shifter's ability has lasted longer than a minute, or could be done more than once between rests, they would be significantly better, but I would still call it underwhelming. And yeah, I just, I hate to end it on a down note, but I do not like the Shifter so much. I do really like the Kalashtar. I was actually really glad when Mara came up with the idea for this video, because honestly, when I was skimming through the book, when I came across the Kalashtar, my initial reaction was, sounds weird, and I just kind of moved past it without giving it much more thought. Doing this video caused me to really read it in a little bit more detail and think more about the possibilities, and I hope it's done the same for you.
Yes, now, we hope that you liked this video. If you did, please leave a like and perhaps leave a comment on what you want to see next, or even subscribe if you want to get regular updates as to what we're releasing. Next time, we will be talking about half-elves versus half-orcs. What's the difference, and which one is more powerful?